Yes, thank you very much for the kind and warm welcome. Yes, as Professor Dr. Rajagopal said, I'm going to just not repeat what my speaker before said, but I'm going to take an in-depth look at the geographical correlation criteria as in the delegated acts. You can see in the very bottom that this is a short study that I've conducted on behalf of the GIZ and the PTX Hub. So this is one of the things the PTX Hub does. They give out studies on in-depth topics by consultancies. So this is one of them, and we've conducted this study already. I'm going to show you a little bit of the key results, and specifically, as this was a request from the working group, give recommendations for action, and we can actually look into one of the major uncertainties that I have experienced from projects in India concerning bidding zones. But yeah, please, for the next slide, I'm going to show you shortly the agenda for today. There's almost as many agenda points as slides, so no worries. This will not take too long, but just to give you a short motivation behind this study again, to then go over the overview and criteria for the I know you can stay on the slides too, Pooja, thank you. Then going into an overview for the geographical correlation, and then we will see why bidding zones is one of the major uncertainties within projects in India. And within that scope, I'm going to talk about the European electricity system and where the reasoning for these bidding zones actually sources from, to then take a look at the Indian electricity system to identify gaps in between the two, and to then show why this actually has an effect, and why green hydrogen projects in India should take a deeper look into how they can make use of these certification schemes that Mr. Shale has mentioned, and to then come to a short conclusion and a recommendation for action. So thank you, Pooja. Now for the next slide. As we all know, there are uncertainties with these delegated acts. They are not trivial, and you need experts, or you need a little bit of time to deep dive into them. And this obviously can cause confusion and uncertainties for third countries which are not involved in the whole regulation process within the EU. So as we know, the European Union has a plan to produce renewable hydrogen, but also to import renewable hydrogen from third countries. And it's 10 million tons in 2030 that will be produced, or are planned to be produced, within the EU and imported. So this is renewable hydrogen. I just want to make a quick disclaimer, because this I've heard was also an uncertainty. This doesn't mean that non-renewable hydrogen is not allowed to be imported to the EU. The EU has just simply set goals for renewable hydrogen. It doesn't mean that you cannot export non-renewable hydrogen, for example, CCUS, or from other sourcing technologies. But this is the goal that has been set, and this is and the criteria for this goal have been set as well. So obviously this will have a major focus on the EU, but it doesn't mean that it's restricted to only this. As Mr. Shale has already showed, there's the main objective why we are doing this is because the Paris Agreement has set climate change mitigation goals, and within these we want to reduce CO2 emissions. So obviously other production routes can also reduce CO2 emissions, but they will not be renewable as for the delegated acts of the European Union. So this is our starting point. We have rules, and as Mr. Shale said, these rules are not only imposed to inside the European Union, but also outside, and this makes them essential for projects who want to export or import, however you want to look at it, to the EU. But, and this is the motivation behind this study, third countries outside the EU might have different electricity system and market designs, which might be not as compatible with the rules set from the regulatory framework as the one in the EU. So what we are looking at today, and what I want to show you, are the results of looking into the Indian electricity system, and specifically looking into the geographical correlation, and within that the concept of bidding zones. because bidding zones, they're not only mentioned within the geographical correlation, but you can see them everywhere in the, not everywhere, but in various different locations in the delegated acts. So please, next slide. So now to give you a quick overview on the criteria as mentioned, I don't want to go into too much of a detail. My message of this on this slide is that bidding zones are very important to understand what the reasoning behind them are. You can see geographical correlation here as in the delegated act. You can comply with one of the three options you see below under ABC. Either you are within the same bidding zone. This example over here, DE, stands for Germany, and on the left corner, top corner, it's the Netherlands and Denmark. Germany actually shares a bidding zone with Luxembourg as well, but just for the sake of simplicity, we're looking at one bidding zone that is Germany. And if your installation generating renewable electricity is located in the same bidding zone as your electrolyzer, you are complied with the geographical correlation criteria. You can be interconnected between two bidding zones with your renewable energy source. Then your day-ahead market price within, as in the example here in the Netherlands, has to be higher than the one in Germany. Then you are complied with correlation, geographical correlation. And the last one, offshore bidding zones, means you have an offshore wind park that is connected also to your bidding zone that your electrolyzer is located in. And then there's a couple of other criteria that Mr. Scheel has already mentioned, that generally if your electrolyzer is located in a bidding zone where there's a very low emission factor for the electricity within the grid, or a very high share of renewable energy, then you're automatically counted as renewable. But again, bidding zones. So the requirements, not only on geographical correlation, but also in general, are very closely linked to the concept of bidding zones. And now, why is that? So we can go to the next slide. What actually are bidding zones, and what is the reasoning behind them? As you can see here on the right-hand side, this is a little bit small, but I think the main point I want to make here is still recognizable. You see that a map of Europe, but it's actually a map of bidding zones. So if any of you have been to Italy or to Scandinavia, you can see the color scheme of one country doesn't necessarily mean one bidding zone, but it can actually be subdivided into several bidding zones. And that is because the European regulation defines bidding zones as, quote, the largest geographical area within which market participants are able to exchange energy without capacity allocation. So the entire concept of bidding zones is closely linked to structural congestions within the electricity grid. And in case of hydrogen, obviously this is important, because if I have a renewable energy source, a wind park or a solar park in one bidding zone that is not sufficiently connected with transmission lines to the bidding zone where my electrolyzer is located in, obviously I cannot guarantee that renewable electricity flows into my electrolyzer. So this general problem is accounted for within the delegated act, saying, okay, it might actually be a fossil fuel based generation plant for your electricity that feeds into your electrolyzer. We have to make sure that we mitigate that, and that we mitigate possible curtailment of renewable electricity. What is important now is that the European Commission allows hydrogen producers in third countries which have not, or which don't have bidding zones in that sense, to rely on equivalent concepts. If the objective of the delegated act that I've just explained is maintained, and the most similar concept of that to bidding zones in the EU is implemented in the third country. So this means two things. First, bidding zones, the concept of bidding zones, meaning congestion in the grid, we want to mitigate it, and we need to incorporate it in the delegated act, is one thing. But if you go outside of Europe, this might not be the case for every country. So there might be countries that are very well connected inter and between bidding zones. So this is the reason why we are looking now at India to see, are there bidding zones? Is this the most similar concept to the bidding zones we have in the EU? So please, next slide. And the electricity exchange between Indian bidding areas is actually possible nearly without capacity allocation and market splits. So with this, I'm sure most of the participants already are aware of. There was in 2013, India accomplished one nation, one grid, one frequency. Still, there were transmission capacities that were not sufficient to transport electricity from one region or one state or one bidding zone to the other. So this led to market splitting, meaning I have to, if I cannot transport electricity from one bidding zone to the other, obviously I might not be able to have the same electricity price in these regions. So therefore, market splitting. This market splitting is now, as for days, still seen as in the bidding zones. So this is more of an administrative reasoning now. And with the governmental initiative in 2014, India has actually achieved one of the largest synchronous interconnected electricity grids in the world. So now almost, I'm saying almost because obviously there might still be congestions in the transmission grid, electricity can be freely exchanged, resulting also in a single price across different grid areas. And in this example, you see the day-ahead bidding areas. Now, if you remember, the reasoning behind the European bidding zones are that you can transport electricity without capacity allocation. And this is the case here. So India, with its interconnected electricity grid, is sufficient to transport inter and intrastate electricity, making it actually one comprehensive bidding zone in the idea of the concept of bidding zones of the EU. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk now about the effect. I think this is quite straightforward, but just to show this again to participants as well, when they're looking at green hydrogen projects, obviously you want to maximize your electrolyzers load. So the best is to have it 8,760 hours a year running at full capacity and with 100% renewable energy. Now, this is not always the case because renewable energy as wind and solar are volatile. But what I can show you here, and I don't want to go too much into detail, is that if you have a well-balanced portfolio of wind and solar, it can be actually to 25% cheaper, translating it into 1.3 euros per kilogram than a portfolio of only using solar. Now, why that is not part of this project. If you have questions on this, feel free to get in contact. But the general message is that in India, obviously, we have different potentials for wind and solar energy spread out the country. And we have ports that have maybe existing infrastructure planning to export to the EU. So now, obviously, what you want to do is to build a big electrolyzer, maybe with an ammonia plant right next to it in a harbor with existing infrastructure, and source your electricity from PPAs spread out the country with very good renewable energy sources. But if we apply the rules of the Delegated Act as it is for today, we do have bidding areas or bidding zones within India. So now the question is, what is most similar? Just the pure semantic of the words, bidding area, bidding zone, or is it the concept behind it? And from my perspective, it's the concept. The concept is you can transmit electricity freely between market participants, and this is the case in India most of the time, and more of the time than it is actually in the bidding zone in Germany. So now, considering of all I've shown you, we could come to the conclusion that India is one comprehensive bidding zone, and if we can use this advantage, it actually will lead to a much more attractive location to produce hydrogen than if we implement the rules as for now. So if we go to the next slide, and this will also be my last slide, concluding of what I've said, India can be considered as one bidding zone, and now we go in the circle to what my colleague Mr. Scheel has said. It all comes down to recognized schemes by the European Union who go into these projects in India to your project that you might be developing, and gives you a certification that your renewable hydrogen is renewable as in the Delegated Act of the EU. And depending on how your project looks like, for example, as I've shown, you have an electrolyzer at a harbor, but you want to source from the north of India from a wind power plant. This would not be one bidding zone. You can ask a certification scheme, a voluntary one, and if that certification scheme has the same reasoning behind the study that I've just shown you, that India actually is a bidding zone, you would be complied with the geographic criteria. So my final remarks and recommendations would be to promote a showcase in India in which a certification scheme which is recognized by the EU gives a certification saying India is one bidding zone with this particular project, and it should therefore be considered as renewable. In that sense, obviously, it has to comply with other criteria like temporal correlation and additionality, as Mr. Scheel has said. But this would actually, from my point of view, waive the uncertainties and the investment risks that are associated with this problem in these green hydrogen projects. So this is it from my side. Very happy to get into a fruitful discussion, and feel free to ask questions. My contact data also is on the last slide. These slides will be shared as I've heard. So very happy to discuss and answer questions. Thank you.